My son-in-law didn't know I owned the company he works for as CEO. He always saw me living simple. One day, he invited me to dinner with his parents. I wanted to see how they'd treat a poor man until they slid an envelope across the table. 2 minutes later, I've worn the same flannel shirt to family dinners for 6 years running. People assume it's because I can't afford better. That assumption has saved me more headaches than you'd believe, and it's the reason I let it stand every single time. Here's what nobody outside my accountant and my lawyer knows. I've owned a controlling stake in a mid-sized logistics and distribution company since I was 34 years old. Not a small operation. Warehouses in 6 states, a fleet that moves freight up and down 3 time zones, revenue that would make most people's eyes water if they saw the filings. But my name isn't on the letterhead, isn't on the public board roster, isn't anywhere a casual search would find it. I built the ownership structure that way on purpose, back when I was young enough to still be figuring out who I wanted to be, and old enough to already know that money changes how people look at you before they've even decided if they like you. My wife used to tease me about it, said I was the richest poor man she'd ever met, driving a truck with a check engine light that had been on so long, neither of us remembered what triggered it. She passed 11 years ago, cancer, quick in the way that's supposed to be a mercy and never quite feels like one. After that, the simple life stopped being a strategy and started being the only thing that made sense to me. Big houses felt like empty rooms with better lighting. I sold the one we'd bought together within a year and moved into something a third the size, something I could actually feel present in. My daughter was 22 when her mother died. She took it hard, the way you'd expect, and I watched her rebuild herself slowly over the following 2 years. Watched her go back to school, watched her start dating again with the kind of caution people carry when they've learned early that things can be taken from you without warning. That's how she met him. A work function, some conference her firm sent her to, a mixer afterward where he introduced himself and apparently made her laugh within the first 5 minutes. She came home that weekend lighter than I'd seen her in a long time, and I remember thinking, quietly, that I'd let myself hope again on her behalf. He came to dinner at my place about a month later. Nervous handshake, the kind where a young man grips too hard because someone once told him a firm handshake matters more than it actually does, polite to a fault. Complimented the house, which at that point was a rental with secondhand furniture, and I watched him mean it, or at least commit to the performance of meaning it, and either way, it told me something. He asked about my work, and I gave him the vague answer I'd perfected over the years. Consulting, mostly some freight logistics, nothing exciting, and he nodded like that satisfied him, and moved on to asking about my daughter's childhood instead. That struck me. Most young men angling for approval ask about your career because they're calculating something. He asked about her instead. I didn't tell him what I owned. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't distrust exactly, not yet. It was pattern recognition. I've watched wealth do strange things to otherwise decent people, watched it happen slowly enough that the person it's happening to never notices the change in themselves. I wanted to know who my daughter had chosen before that knowledge could color anything. If he loved her the way I hoped he did, the money would never need to enter the equation at all. If it did need to enter the equation eventually, I wanted enough evidence banked by then to know exactly what I was dealing with. For a while, the evidence was good. He worked at a firm downtown, an analyst position, nothing glamorous, and he worked it hard. Weekends sometimes, late nights he'd apologize to my daughter about bringing her takeout on the way home to make up for the hours. She'd call me sometimes just to talk about how solid he felt, how different from the men she dated in her 20s who treated ambition like a personality trait instead of an actual practice. I remember being genuinely glad. I remember thinking, this is the part of the story where I get to relax a little. I should say now because it matters for everything that comes after. The company he worked for was mine. Not a coincidence. Or rather, it was a coincidence at first. The kind where your daughter happens to date someone in an industry adjacent to your own. And then it stopped being a coincidence and became something I had to actively manage. I never told him. I never used my position to help him or hurt him in those early years. Not once. And I want that on the record because later, when everything came apart, it would have been easy for him to claim I'd rigged the game from the start. I hadn't. He earned every promotion he got in those years on his own merit, under managers who had no idea their chairman's future son-in-law was sitting 3 cubicles over. They got married 2 years after that first dinner. I walked her down the aisle in a suit that cost $400, the nicest thing I owned, and I remember catching his eye during the ceremony and thinking he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. I wanted to believe that look would last. For a while it did. The promotion happened 18 months into the marriage. Legitimate, through the normal channels, the board reviewing his performance the same way they'd review anyone's. I made a point of staying entirely out of that process, didn't so much as glance at his file, because I needed it to be real if it happened at all. It happened. The youngest CEO the company had ever had, and for about a week after the announcement, I was proud of him in a way that felt uncomplicated, felt like watching my daughter's choice get validated by people who had no idea they were validating anything personal at all. The week after that is where I'd point to now. If you asked me to name the exact moment things started shifting, small things first. He stopped asking my daughter how her day went and started asking what she'd accomplished, like her time needed to be justified to him in output. He bought a car, something German and low to the ground that looked deeply uncomfortable to get in and out of, and he mentioned the price at a family dinner in a tone that wasn't quite bragging, but wasn't not not bragging either, a tone calibrated to make sure everyone at the table did the math themselves. My daughter noticed before I let myself admit I'd noticed. She called me one evening, voice careful in the way it gets when she's trying to downplay something to keep me from worrying, and told me he'd made a comment about her wardrobe needing to catch up now that he was representing a certain image professionally. I asked her what that meant exactly. She laughed it off, said he probably just meant nicer work clothes, said I was reading too much into it. I let her have that interpretation because she needed to, not because I believed it. The dinners were where it showed most clearly, because dinners were the only setting where I got a direct view of how he treated the people around him when he assumed nobody in the room had any leverage over him. I remember one in particular, maybe 4 months after the promotion. I'd worn what I always wore, the flannel, work boots, nothing that announced anything about me one way or another. And he looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not dislike exactly, something closer to embarrassment, the specific kind a person feels about something they've decided reflects poorly on them by association. You know, he said, cutting into whatever we were eating, not really looking at me when he said it. I could get you into a decent tailor. On me. It's really not a big deal. I told him I was comfortable in what I had. He shrugged in a way that suggested he'd expected that answer and had already decided it confirmed something he believed about me. My daughter's jaw tightened across the table. She didn't say anything either, and I understood why. Calling it out in the moment would have meant a fight, and she was still, at that point, choosing to believe these were isolated moments rather than a pattern establishing itself. I want to be fair to him here because fairness matters to me even now, even knowing how the story ends. The stress of a CEO position at his age was real. The scrutiny was real. Boards can be brutal to young executives who they suspect got the seat too early, and I know from decades of watching other companies that the pressure to prove yourself in that chair can genuinely warp a person's sense of what matters. I told myself that for longer than I probably should have. I told myself the man who'd asked about my daughter's childhood at that first dinner was still in there somewhere, just buried under something temporary. It wasn't temporary. Over the following months, I watched the pattern solidify. He started correcting my daughter's grammar in front of guests, gently at first, the kind of correction that gets dressed up as helpfulness. He started referring to his own family's social circle with a kind of reverence he never extended to mine. Name-dropping people at dinners like their approval was a currency everyone at the table should recognize as valuable. He hired a private chauffeur, which struck me as excessive for a man who'd been perfectly capable of driving himself 6 months earlier, and when my daughter asked him about the expense, he told her, in front of me, that some things were simply beneath a man in his position now. I remember driving home that night thinking about the version of him I'd met at that first dinner, the one who'd asked about her instead of about me, and wondering how much of that had ever been real versus how much had been a performance calibrated for an audience he thought might matter to his future. I didn't have an answer. I still don't, fully. What I did have by that point was enough evidence accumulating that I started paying closer attention than I had before, not with any plan in mind yet, just the quiet, watchful instinct of a father who suspects something in his daughter's life is drifting somewhere he won't like. By the second year of his tenure as CEO, the pattern I'd been watching quietly had stopped being subtle enough to explain away. My daughter started calling me late at night after he'd gone to sleep, her voice pitched low like she was worried the walls would carry it to him. The finances were the first real casualty. She'd always managed her own money. She has a finance degree. She was better with numbers than either of us growing up. But somewhere around that second year, he restructured their joint accounts so that anything above a small monthly allowance required his sign-off. He framed it to her as consolidation, as simplifying things now that his salary dwarfed her own. But the effect was that she couldn't buy so much as a birthday gift for a friend without a conversation first. She told me once, and I could hear her trying to keep her voice even while she said it, that he'd told her a high society wife needed to learn her place and stop embarrassing him with what he called her middle-class habits. I asked her directly, the way a father eventually has to, whether she was safe. She said yes, immediately, and I believed her. This wasn't physical, wasn't the kind of danger where you call the authorities and get someone out that same night. It was slower than that, and in some ways harder to act on because everything he did could be individually explained away as reasonable if you squinted at it in isolation. It was only the accumulation that told the real story. Around that time, his parents came into the picture more directly. His father and his mother had always been peripheral to the marriage. Old money, the kind that's been old for long enough to forget it was ever new, the kind that treats a certain manner of speaking and a certain manner of dressing as evidence of character rather than evidence of circumstance. They flew in for an extended visit that spring, ostensibly to see their son in his new role, and I watched my son-in-law absorb their worldview over those weeks like a plant finally getting the light it had been missing. He'd always had the instinct in him, I think now, looking back. Their presence just gave it permission. The clearest example of how far things had drifted came at my daughter's birthday, a few weeks into his parents' visit. I'd saved for a while to buy her something meaningful, a hand-carved wooden jewelry box, the kind of thing that takes an actual craftsman real hours to make, similar to one her mother used to keep on her dresser when my daughter was young. I wasn't trying to compete with anything. I was trying to give her something that connected to a part of her life that predated all of this. We were at their apartment, a penthouse that still felt too too large and too cold every time I visited it, and I handed her the box while his parents watched from the sofa, with expressions I'd already learned to read as quiet judgment. She hadn't even gotten the lid open before he took it from her hands. "Thanks for the kindling," he said, setting it down on the kitchen counter without looking at it again. "I got her a necklace that costs more than your entire net worth, so let's not pretend the arts and crafts project is really competing here." My daughter's face went through several things at once: embarrassment, anger, something that looked almost like grief, before she excused herself to the bedroom. His parents didn't intervene. His father actually laughed, a short exhale through the nose that told me exactly where his son had learned to treat cruelty as a kind of wit. I stood up. I want to be honest that in the moment, I nearly told him everything right then, nearly let 6 years of careful silence collapse in a kitchen over a jewelry box, because watching my daughter walk away crying from a man who'd once asked about her childhood with what looked like real tenderness was one of the harder things I'd sat through as a parent. I didn't say it. I looked at him instead and told him that wealth wasn't about what sat in a bank account, that it was about character, and that his was looking pretty bankrupt at the moment. He laughed at that too, told me to keep telling myself that while I drove home in what he called my piece of junk car and adjusted his cuffs like the conversation had cost him nothing at all. I drove home that night more shaken than I let myself admit for a few days afterward. Not because of what he'd said about me. I'd made peace with how he saw me a long time before that evening, because of what I now understood he was willing to do to my daughter in front of an audience without a flicker of hesitation. Whatever restraint he'd shown in the early years of the marriage had fully burned off. What remained was someone who'd decided cruelty and status were the same instrument, and who intended to keep playing it as loudly as his position would allow. I want to tell you about the night I almost ended this the easy way, because I think it matters for understanding why I chose the path I eventually took instead. About 2 months after the birthday incident, I decided I'd had enough of watching from a distance. I drove to their building unannounced on a Thursday evening. No plan beyond the vague idea that I was going to sit him down and tell him plainly that I knew exactly who owned the company he ran, and that his behavior toward my daughter and toward me was going to have consequences he hadn't anticipated. I'd rehearsed it in the car the whole way over. I remember feeling something almost like relief at the idea of finally saying it out loud, of not having to carry the weight of the secret through one more strained family dinner. He answered the door alone. My daughter was out, some work function of her own, and for a moment I almost turned around and left rather than have the conversation without her present. I didn't. I told him we needed to talk, and something in my tone must have registered as unusual, because he stepped aside and let me in without the usual performance of reluctant hospitality. I sat down across from him in that too-cold penthouse living room, and I told him all of it. The ownership structure, the years of staying quiet on purpose, the fact that I'd watched his entire career unfold from a position he had no idea existed. I watched his face while I said it, waiting for the moment it would land, waiting for the arrogance to crack the way I'd imagined it would in the car on the drive over. It didn't crack. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not the laugh of a man who's just been caught. A genuine, dismissive laugh, the kind you give someone you've already decided isn't worth taking seriously. He told me that was, and I'm quoting him as closely as memory allows, the most elaborate thing he'd ever heard a father-in-law try in an attempt to seem relevant. He said the company's ownership was a matter of public record through the holding entities everyone in the industry already knew about, that he'd have heard if some flannel-wearing retiree secretly controlled the board, and that I should maybe consider that spending money on new hobbies would be healthier than spending it on this particular fantasy. I sat there for a moment, stunned less by his disbelief than by how completely it demolished the version of this conversation I'd rehearsed. I hadn't planned for him simply not believing me. I'd assumed the truth, once spoken, would carry its own weight. It didn't. Without documentation in front of him, without the phone call that would later prove it beyond argument, I was just an old man in a flannel shirt making an outlandish claim in his living room, and he treated me exactly like that, with a kind of pitying amusement that was, if anything, more insulting than if he'd gotten angry. I left without pressing further. I want to be honest that some of that was strategic, and some of it was simply that I didn't have the stomach in that moment to keep arguing for my own credibility in a conversation I'd walked into voluntarily. Driving home, I turned the whole thing over and over. Part of me wondered if I'd made a mistake even trying, if I'd tipped my hand for nothing and given him a story he could now tell at future dinners about the night his eccentric father-in-law claimed to be a secret billionaire. But another part of me, the part that had spent 6 years building patience into a discipline, recognized something useful in how badly that conversation had gone. He hadn't believed me because I'd given him nothing but words. If I was ever going to do this again, it wouldn't be in his living room on his terms, with nothing behind the claim but my own insistence. It would need to be somewhere public enough that he couldn't simply laugh it off, and it would need proof attached to it that couldn't be waved away as an old man's fantasy. I didn't say anything to my daughter about that night. I didn't see the point in worrying her over a conversation that had gone nowhere, and some part of me, I'll admit, was embarrassed at how badly I'd misjudged the moment. I went back to waiting. I went back to the flannel and the truck and the quiet accumulation of patience, except now I was waiting for something specific rather than waiting in the vague hope that things would simply resolve themselves. I was waiting for the moment he'd hand me an opening I couldn't be laughed out of. It came about about 3 weeks later, in the form of a formal dinner invitation with his parents' names on it. The invitation came by mail, which struck me as strange before I even opened it. Everything in that family happened by phone or by text, quick and disposable, so a physical card meant someone wanted a record of formality attached to whatever this was. It was addressed from his parents, not from him, though his name was listed alongside theirs as a host. A dinner at a French restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the valet parking alone costs more than a week of groceries used to cost me on a Tuesday evening, just the three of them and me. My daughter's name was conspicuously absent from the guest list, and the note attached, typed rather than handwritten, said only that they needed to discuss the future of the family dynamic. I read that sentence probably a dozen times over the following hour, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. I didn't need much imagination to guess what it meant. This was going to be an intervention of some kind, orchestrated by people who decided my presence in their son's life had become a liability worth formally addressing, and they'd chosen to leave my daughter out of it specifically so there'd be no one in the room inclined to defend me. I spent the 2 days before that dinner doing something I hadn't done in years. I reviewed the company's recent filings in detail, not out of any specific suspicion yet, just old habit reasserting itself, the instinct of someone who built something and never fully stopped checking on it even after handing the daily operations to people he trusted. What I found gave the evening an entirely different shape than I'd expected going in. My son-in-law had been making unauthorized expenditures against corporate accounts for months. Not massive amounts individually. A private chef here, travel upgrades there, a membership at a club that billed itself as exclusive and billed the company directly for the privilege. But the pattern, once I started actually looking, was unmistakable. He'd assumed, correctly in most cases, that nobody would scrutinize a new CEO's receipts too closely in his first 18 months. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that the person with ultimate authority over those accounts might decide, on a random Tuesday, to actually look. I didn't plan to use that information at the dinner. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy in hindsight to make this sound like I walked in with a prepared ambush. I didn't. I walked in with the knowledge sitting quietly in my back pocket, the way you carry an umbrella on a day that might or might not rain, not because you're certain you'll need it, but because you'd rather have it than not. The evening of the dinner, I got dressed the same way I got dressed for every family gathering. The flannel, worn soft at the elbows from years of washing, work boots that had been resoled twice. I looked at myself in the mirror before I left and had a strange, brief moment of clarity about what I was actually doing, dressing deliberately beneath what I could afford, walking willingly into a room full of people who'd already decided what my clothes meant about my worth, because some part of me needed to see, one final time, exactly how far they'd let their contempt go when they thought there was nothing on the other side of it to answer for. I drove my truck, the same one I'd had for 11 years, the check engine light glowing faithfully on the dash, the way it had for longer than either my daughter or I could remember its original cause. The valet at the restaurant took one look at it and one look at me and made no effort to hide his opinion of either. I handed him a 20 and walked past him without comment, because whatever was about to happen in that dining room, it wasn't going to be decided by a valet's assumptions about who deserved respect. I want to say, honestly, that I felt calm walking in. I didn't, not entirely. There was a version of that walk where I imagined turning around, driving home, letting the whole confrontation dissolve unaddressed the way I'd let so many smaller ones dissolve over the previous 2 years. But I'd already tried the quiet route once, in his living room, and watched it accomplish nothing but give him a story to laugh about. This time I had proof in my back pocket and 6 years of patience behind me, and some part of me had simply run out of room to keep absorbing what this family thought they were entitled to say to me without consequence. I gave my name to the host and was led toward the private booth in the back, where I could already see the three of them seated, wine glasses catching the low light, looking, even from a distance, like people who'd rehearsed this evening as carefully as I had. His parents were already seated when I reached the booth, his mother in pearls that probably cost more than my truck, appraising me the moment I came into view with the specific expression of someone doing inventory of every single thing wrong with what she was looking at. His father didn't look up right away, occupied with the wine list like it demanded the full weight of his attention. My son-in-law stood briefly, out of some reflexive habit of manners that hadn't quite been overridden by everything else that had changed in him. His handshake was nothing like that first one, years ago, the too firm grip of a nervous young man trying to make a good impression. This one was limp, perfunctory, a gesture performed because the alternative would have been visibly rude in front of his parents. "Dad, glad you could make it," he said, his eyes dropping to my boots and staying there half a second too long. Dressed like that, I sat down without responding to the comment directly, ordered water when the server came by, which drew a small, almost imperceptible exchange of glances between his mother and father, the kind of look that says a great deal without either party needing to say a word. Throughout the appetizer course, his mother talked at length about their family's real estate holdings, a lake property, a place in the mountains, a townhouse somewhere I'd never heard of and didn't ask about, in a tone that assumed everyone at the table shared both her interest and her frame of reference. His father contributed occasional remarks about the appalling lack of ambition in the modern working class, delivered with the specific confidence of a man who had never once needed to develop ambition himself, having inherited the need for it out of existence generations before he was born. My son-in-law sat through all of it without defending anyone, without so much as glancing my way when his mother's comments edged close enough to me that a reasonable person might have felt some obligation to redirect the conversation. He swirled his wine, checked his phone twice, and generally conducted himself like a man attending a meeting he considered beneath him, but had agreed to sit through as a formality. I asked at one point what specifically we were there to discuss, since the invitation had mentioned something about the family dynamic, and I hadn't been given any more detail than that. His mother smiled at me in a way that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "All in good time," she said. "Let's enjoy the meal first." I understood by that point that this was a performance with a script they'd rehearsed, and that I wasn't going to get anything out of them until the moment they'd chosen to deliver it. I ate what I ordered. I answered his father's occasional question with short, factual answers that gave nothing away. Watched them build toward whatever this was with the patience of someone who had, by that point, been patient for 6 years and could manage a little longer. The entrees arrived and the tone in the booth shifted almost immediately, the small talk falling away like it had only ever been a formality to get through before the real business could start. My son-in-law set down his fork with a deliberateness that told me he'd rehearsed this part specifically. The way you rehearse a line you're worried might not land if you don't get the delivery exactly right. "We should talk about optics," he said, and I noticed his mother straighten slightly in her seat. "Ready, the way you'd position yourself to watch something you'd been looking forward to. I'm running one of the largest companies in this city now. People notice who I associate with, professionally and personally. It's getting increasingly difficult to explain who you are to people who actually matter." I let that sit for a moment before I answered. "How do you explain me exactly?" He didn't have a ready answer for that, which told me something, but his mother filled the silence before it could stretch uncomfortably long. She reached into the designer handbag at her side and produced a thick white envelope, the kind that announces its contents through weight alone before you've even opened it, and slid it across the tablecloth until it came to rest directly in front of my water glass. "There's $50,000 in there," she said, her voice pleasant in a way that made the words somehow worse than if she'd been openly hostile. "Enough for a comfortable fresh start somewhere else. Somewhere your daughter's new life doesn't have to keep intersecting with yours in ways that embarrass her husband. She deserves better than having to explain a father who looks like he arrived by city bus." I looked at the envelope sitting there between us, then at my son-in-law, who was watching my reaction with something that looked almost like anticipation, like he'd been waiting a long time to see this particular expression cross my face. "You want me gone," I said, "after everything I've watched you build with my daughter over the past 6 years. "It's not personal," my son-in-law said, finally meeting my eyes now that the substance of the evening was out in the open. There was something almost like relief in his voice, the relief of a man who'd been dreading a confrontation and was glad, now that it had started, to have it moving instead of looming. "It's just where things are now. You should be proud, honestly. I run one of the biggest companies in the city. That's not nothing." "No," I agreed, "it's not nothing." His father cut in at that point, apparently unwilling to let the moment pass without contributing his own weight to it. "Look at yourself," he said, gesturing vaguely at my flannel, my boots, the general fact of me sitting in a Michelin-starred dining room looking, in his estimation, like a mechanic who'd wandered in off the street. "Our family has a reputation to uphold. My son moves in circles with people who matter, executives, board members, people whose good opinion is worth something. We cannot have a father-in-law who looks like he's lurking in the shadows of his own daughter's life." I noted quietly the shift in how he referred to him. Not "your husband," not the careful distance these dinners usually kept, but something more possessive, more territorial, like the son himself had become an asset worth defending. Something about hearing it now, that particular contempt directed my way, sharpened the moment into something I could feel in my chest. I didn't touch the envelope. I looked at my son-in-law directly and asked him one question, the one I'd been waiting the better part of 2 years to have real cause to ask. "Do you know who signs off on your employment contract? Who has final authority to approve or terminate it whenever they choose?" He laughed, actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and glanced sideways at his mother like I'd said something charming in its naivety. "Obviously, the board does," he said. "I answer to the board. That's how public companies work, in case that wasn't obvious to you." "The board answers to me," I said. "I've owned controlling interest in that company since before you were born. I sat quietly through your entire hiring process, said nothing, watched you earn every promotion you got on merit. I never once touched, because I wanted to see who you'd become once you thought no one who actually mattered to your career was in the room." The table went completely silent. His mother's hand, halfway back toward her wine glass, simply stopped moving. My son-in-law's face went through several stages in the space of a few seconds. Confusion, disbelief, the exact expression I'd failed to get out of him in his living room 3 weeks earlier, arriving now with the full weight of proof behind it instead of just my word. "That's not," he started, and then stopped, because there was genuinely nothing to finish that sentence with that wouldn't have made things worse. I reached into my flannel shirt pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't stand up to make the call somewhere private. I set it face up in the center of the table, turned the volume to maximum, and dialed a number that bypassed every layer of assistant and gatekeeper the company maintained, straight through to the one person who could confirm, in real time, in front of all 3 of them, them that every word I'd just said was true. The phone barely completed a full ring before it connected. "Sir, is everything all right?" The voice was sharp, immediately alert. I recognized it as clearly as my own reflection. The chairman of the board, a man who'd worked alongside me for over 2 decades and knew exactly what it meant when I called this number outside business hours. My son-in-law froze, the color draining from his face, because he knew that voice too, heard it in every executive meeting, understood exactly what kind of authority it represented. "Everything's fine," I said, leaning back in my seat, deliberately unhurried. "I'm having dinner with our CEO and his family, and I've come to a definitive conclusion about his future with the organization." "What kind of issue are we discussing, sir?" the chairman asked, his tone shifting immediately into something businesslike and serious, no hesitation at all, no questioning of my authority to be making this call. My son-in-law's father tried to interject, sputtering something about this being an absurd stunt. I ignored him entirely. "Terminate his contract as CEO, effective immediately," I said, watching each word land like a physical blow he couldn't brace against. "Freeze his stock options pending a forensic audit of his expense activity. Have security clear his office and escort him from the building tomorrow." The silence in that booth had a texture to it I don't think I'll ever fully describe accurately. My son-in-law himself looked smaller than I'd ever seen him look. All the confidence that had carried him through 18 months of casual cruelty simply evacuated from his body in the space of about 10 seconds. I ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. My son-in-law was shaking, his hands gripping the table edge hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. "What?" he started, his voice cracking, sounding for the first time genuinely young. How do you know the chairman? What did you just do?" I stood up slowly. "It's not a trick," I said. "You wanted to know how your family would treat a poor man tonight. Now you get to find out exactly how a company treats a CEO who forgot who actually owned it." His father found his voice again, standing as well. "Do you have any idea who we are? You can't simply pretend to fire my son. He is the chief executive officer of that company." "Your son was the chief executive officer," I said, "of a company I founded before he was old enough to walk. I gave him that position to see if he was a man of enough character to take care of my daughter without needing to be watched. You taught him that wealth means treating people like they're beneath you. That was the wrong lesson. It's the lesson that just cost him everything." His mother was staring at the envelope, then up at me. I reached down, picked it up, and set it back in front of my son-in-law without ceremony. "Keep the $50,000, I told him. "You'll need every dollar once the forensic audit finishes going through your expense reports." I didn't wait for a response from any of them. I stood, straightened my flannel, and walked out without looking back to see whatever expressions were still working themselves out on their faces. The valet handed me the keys without the earlier contempt, though I doubt he understood what had shifted in the last 20 minutes. I drove home with the check engine light glowing on the dash the way it always did, and for the first time in 11 years, I didn't register it as an annoyance. He called that weekend. 6 times Saturday, 4 more Sunday, each going straight to voicemail because I let it. I'd spent 6 years being patient, 3 weeks being deliberate, and one dinner finally saying out loud everything I'd carried quietly since before he'd even met my daughter. There wasn't anything left to discuss on a call I hadn't asked for. Monday evening, I heard a key turn in my front door. My daughter, letting herself in the way she has since she was old enough to need one. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she said anything, holding her phone loosely at her side like she'd been staring at it for most of the drive over. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd braced myself for. "Is it true?"